Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kirsten Martzi, and I'm the manager of Education and Community Engagement Programs at the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center. It's my pleasure to be your host for tonight's talk on Minor White with Catherine Barth, followed by a Q&A with all of you. Admission for this program is pay as you wish. If you would like to donate to the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center to support this and future arts programs, you can do so at brattleboromuseum.org/support. You'll also find information about membership on that page as well. This event is presented in connection with the exhibit Sequences Ode to Minor White, which was curated by Catherine Gasteau and is on view through October 11th at BMAC. In tonight's program, Catherine Barth will give a presentation about Minor White and his work as a photographer, teacher, and advocate. You are welcome to ask questions at any time, and we will save time at the end for Catherine to answer them. So in just a moment, I'll ask Catherine to join me on screen. The plan is that she will speak for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions and comments. To submit a question or comment, if you're here via Zoom, please use the Q&A button on your screen, and you can do that at any time, and we'll get to them at the end of the talk. If you're watching on Facebook Live, you can type your questions and comments there, and we'll keep an eye on that too. And with that housekeeping taken care of, I'd like to ask Catherine to turn on her camera and mic, and while she's doing that, I'll introduce her. Catherine Barth received her Ph.D. in art history from Emory University in 2021, her MA from Emory, and her BA from William & Mary. She has held Mellon Graduate Research and Object-Centered Curatorial Fellowship in the Photography Department at the High Museum of Art and a Curatorial internship in the Department of Photographs at the J. Paul Getty Museum. Her dissertation, Frederick Sommer, Photography at the Limits of the Avant-Garde, received support from the Amon Carter Museum of American Art's Davidson Family Fellowship, the Center for Creative Photography's Kenneth J. Botto Research Fellowship, and Princeton University Art Museum's Minor White Archive Research Grant. Barth is currently conducting research on Sommer's reception in the 1970s photographic community. Catherine, thank you for being here tonight. It's great to see you, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, and thank you to the Brattleboro Museum of Art for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak to you all about Minor White tonight. So I'm going to go ahead. I have a couple of slides that I've put together, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And while I'm sharing my screen, I also want to thank the Princeton University Art Museum and Archive for their generous support of my research as a graduate student. Their support very much helped me in the dissertation research phase as I was writing and conducting research for my dissertation. So I just want to thank them as well. And without their help, I probably wouldn't be giving this lecture and presentation to you this evening. So I hope everyone can see my screen now. I've titled my talk tonight, Minor White, Photographer, Teacher, and Advocate. I really see these as kind of three major components of Minor White's work as an artist. For those of you who are joining, you haven't been able to see the exhibition, or you're just interested in learning more about Minor White. Minor White was an American photographer who worked primarily around mid-century. The work that we know best of his is the work that he completed probably from the 1940s to the 1960s. And he was a very, very important figure for American photography in the immediate post-war period. And so I'm going to be talking about his role as an artist today, but also I think, more significantly, as it showed up in a lot of my research in the Minor White archive, is his role as a teacher and as an advocate. I wrote my dissertation, as Kirsten mentioned, on another American photographer named Frederick Sommer. And Frederick Sommer is one of those photographers who not often studied, created works that they combine painting and drawing, collage with photography, with the medium of photography. And he was very much kind of pushed to the periphery. And Minor White was a figure who helped to draw him in. And that's how I really started to study Minor White. Minor White is kind of this individual within mid-century American photography who you can't ignore. You can't really do research without, looking at Minor White and looking at his legacy. So I'm so delighted that the Brattleboro Museum has dedicated this, this space and decided to show the work of a number of contemporary photographers, because I think it also is a testament to the sustainment of Minor White's legacy, the fact that, his work is seen to be so resonant with the work that, not only his students did, but also many contemporary photographers. This photograph that we're looking at here is a photograph by Minor White. And it's a photograph, as you can see, from the Minor White archive. And it's a photograph of him in Minnesota, where he kind of grew up and began his career. So this is where he started out. He also worked in Portland during his career. And then he also traveled and worked in California. He taught at the California School of Fine Arts with Ansel Adams, who's a name in photography who many of you probably know quite well. And so he went from Portland to the California School of Fine Arts, and then also taught in Rochester and had many affiliations with the George Eastman House. It was the George Eastman House at the time. Now it's known as the George Eastman Museum. And then he ended his career at MIT in Boston. So that's kind of, to give you a little bit of a rough chronology, that's kind of a breakdown of his career and where he started and kind of where he ended up. So he had these many chapters and kind of segments to his career. This is a photograph that is called The Sound of One Hand Clapping, and it's part of a larger sequence by the same name. And I wanted to show this photograph to kind of give you an example of this idea, the concept of the sequence, which is really, the center of this show at the Brattleboro. And Minor White described the sequence as, he called it a quote, cinema of stills. And so for Minor White as an artist, this sequence was a way to present his work and to give a larger, kind of broader narrative, as opposed to just having a single snapshot or a single photograph that the viewer walking into the museum could see. He decided to show multiple works in sequence, which the viewer, upon viewing these works in multiple, would maybe start to understand something about the photographer's interiority, something about the photographer's message that he wanted to send to the viewer. And there are many stories of Minor White having students study his sequences, reading his photographs to kind of uncover that hidden meaning and message. So this is just one photograph which was exhibited as a full sequence in the 2014 Getty Center exhibition called Minor White Manifestations of the Spirit. And I would encourage anyone who is, wanting to discover more about Minor White and kind of read more about his work as a photographer. The Manifestations of the Spirit exhibition catalog is a really great resource. It was written by Paul Martineau, who also curated the show. Another great catalog to look into if you're interested in learning more about Minor White, and one which has a really wonderful chronology, is The Eye That Shapes, that was written by Peter Bennell. So if you're interested in kind of digging into more research and scholarship, and you kind of want to get to the library and read more about Minor White, I'd highly encourage you to look at those two books, and to read more about Minor White. But this is an example of, why the sequence was important for him. And I love that Catherine, the curator of sequences, Ode to Minor White, has chosen this idea of the sequence, the cinema of stills, as being really central to Minor White, and how he wanted, people coming into a museum to really understand his work. This is another photograph. This one is included in your show, and so I wanted to be able to draw in a work from the show itself to exhibit here. So this is the vicinity of Dansville, New York, from November 1955. And this photograph, it's a really extraordinary photograph. You can see here that Minor White has chosen, this high contrast. So we get this, the dark wood grain that's kind of shown up on the barn in this raking light. The smaller, lighter colored barn next to it. And then we have this kind of ominous, what looks like a telephone, wire or electrical post is kind of cutting through and directing our vision. A really great strategy that a photographer can use to kind of bring us in and draw us into the photograph. And I would also use that as a metaphor for the way that, Minor White really wanted to draw people in, and for them to really understand his photographs and to engage with them in a very deep way, and on a deep level. There's something within the catalog, The Eye That Shapes, where Peter C. Bennell writes really beautifully about photography being a way of life for Minor White. And for Minor White, he was never married, he never had children. And so his students, the photographic community, really filled for him a space, and kind of a community for him within his life. And so I think it's really wonderful to think about that, and to think about photography as a way of life. And here's a quote. I know it's a little bit of text, but here's just a paragraph from Minor White's personal journal called Memorable Fancies. There's a great tradition within the history of photography of photographers documenting their ideas and kind of their daily lives within journals. There's an earlier example of this with another famous American photographer, Edward Weston, who famously kept his own journal, Day Books. So Minor White kept a journal where he really recorded, notes about what was happening day to day, but also ideas about photography and theories about photography, which I should give credit to Kate Bussard, the curator at Princeton, who kind of mentioned to me that within Memorable Fancies, we really see his ideas and his theories of photography really be, he has the kind of the freest expression of them within this journal. I think he felt that he had the most space to kind of record them privately. So we see a lot of his concepts about photography and about other members within the artistic community. So it can be quite fun to read through them, because it almost feels like you're reading through these messages that you're not allowed to see, but you are. And thankfully we have them preserved within the Minor White archive, which again is such a great resource for researchers. So this is a quote about the sequence. And he said that the photographs in a sequence or constellation may be compared to a dance on a theme. The major point or points of the whole are stated and restated with variations until the very last member of the audience has encountered it or them. Likewise, the sequence must be long enough either a number of photographs or time of study to sustain the viewer until he has directly experienced the inner meaning or message or manifestation or being. The viewer who is willing to bring his heart, mind, viscera, and intuition to play upon a sequence will reach an understanding. So I really love this quote. I know it's a little bit long, but I love it, because it's from his personal journal where he recorded all of his ideas about photography. But it also really connects back to the show sequences and to this idea about photography as being able to kind of pierce a sense of interiority and being able to not just have that interiority and relish in that, but to be able to communicate that and share that with your audience. And photography for Minor White really was the medium. It was the way that he could share, his own personal struggles and his own experience with others. And there's a great letter that he wrote to a younger photographer once about this photographer sent him photographs, Edmund Teskey, and Minor White said, the photographs, they're too personal. They need to become more universal. You need to think about, the viewer who's going to be looking at them. So even though the works, they can be abstract and they can be kind of spiritual and transcendent, Minor White was always thinking about what is the kind of greater meaning or message that these photographs have, and what can they convey? What is the meaning beyond just a private meaning, beyond something that's just personal and enclosed? So Minor White, he was an important photographer, and one of the ways that he shared his photography and the work of others was through a very important journal that was conceived in the early 1950s called Aperture Magazine. And Aperture was founded. There were talks beginning at a conference called the Aspen Conference in 1951, where Minor White and a number of other photographers came together, Nancy and Beaumont Newhall, who were curators at the Museum of Modern Art, very, very old and established department of photography, and were very significant figures within the photographic community. So that's at this conference, these photographers were kind of having all of these conversations around fine art photography. And there was a general concern within the community, the fine art photography community, that their work wasn't seen to be very serious, or that photography as a medium was a little bit losing its ground as a serious, fine art category, because they're just coming out of, the two world wars. Documentary photography has very much been privileged, and so they really wanted to turn focus back to fine art photography and to thinking about photographs that could just be valued as works of art and as nothing else. This wasn't to say that there was anything against social documentary work or against the work that was being done in popular magazines and war magazines at this time, but they really wanted to create a space for fine art photography. And I really see that as being the mission of why this journal was conceived and kind of brought to the fore. So these are photographs from the Minor White archive, and they show the mock-ups of Aperture Magazine. Here we see on the left, the mock-up of the front cover. There's a photograph by Dorothea Lange, and then two of the first articles that were published in Aperture Magazine, which I should say is still around today. Minor White was the founding editor of the magazine, and he really used this publication, this journal, to provide a lot of visibility and to give voice to many younger photographers who were up and coming in the field in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s at the time he was the founding editor. And so it's so incredible to see these pictures within the archive. Of the front cover, there's one here of kind of the first couple pages of the magazine with Minor White's article, Exploratory Camera. And then I love this one in the top right, where there's a quote by the famous photographer Ansel Adams: "We have nothing to lose but our photography." And so that quote really just communicates this sense of this great urgency, this great desire to create a space for art photography at this time. This is a picture from that conference that I was discussing, the 1951 Aspen Conference. And here you can see Minor White. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but he is up here in the top left. This is Frederick Sommer, the artist that I wrote my dissertation on. And then here we also see Nancy Newhall and Beaumont Newhall. Nancy Newhall deserves a little bit of a shout out here, I guess I could say. She was an early female photographic curator at MoMA, and she stepped up to the plate when Beaumont Newhall, her husband, went to war. And so she deserves recognition for being an early female curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art. A couple more quotes, I'll quickly go through these. But in his private journal, Memorable Fancies, which he modeled after the work of the day books by Weston, White talked a lot about the future for photography. And my dissertation really explored that idea of, a future for the photographic medium and what that looked like to different photographers who were working in the 1950s and 60s in America. Minor White really wanted to push back against some of the conventions that he saw within the field. And so these are just some quotes from his, I won't go through all of these, but just from his private journal where he comments about exhibitions that were put together by the Newhalls, which he feels are maybe not quite in sync with what he's really seeing, the exciting things that he's seeing in contemporary photography. He's really frustrated about, Ansel Adams keeps getting all these shows and his work is widely published. But Minor White really wanted to see the work of younger photographers be exhibited. And he really wanted to kind of have some debates about what mattered and what should be exhibited. And so writing about Frederick Sommer, he said, "Oh, well, his work makes me angry, but I think we should show it anyway." And I think that, the work, he felt that the work was of a certain caliber. And so whether or not Minor White agreed with the work or felt that, it was the kind of work that he would make, he would choose to exhibit it anyway. And so it's important to note that for a number of photographers, including artists such as Wynne Bullock, Henry Holmes Smith, Aaron Siskind, many of these photographers were published in Aperture, or Minor White, worked with them in some way, and he really helped to jumpstart their careers. And so I think it's very important to just highlight that and to kind of think about that, and just to note that Minor White would often privilege the work of other photographers, even if it was work that he didn't agree with. These are some photographs from within the Minor White archive. I think they're really fantastic because we can just kind of see this photographic community come into formation. I really enjoyed looking at these snapshots. They're about 4 by 5, so they're not that big, but when I was in the archive, I came across this envelope, and just looking through these photographs, I was able to really get a sense of the photographic community and of the different individuals that were kind of the most canonical at this time, and also individuals that were up and coming within this field. And so here I'm showing you 2 photographs from the Minor White archive. The one on the top is of Ansel Adams, and the one on the left is Minor White, who was photographed teaching a course at the California School of Fine Arts. Minor White and Ansel Adams worked together at the California School of Fine Arts. And Minor White very much enjoyed his time working in California, even though he and Ansel Adams, again, like some of the younger photographers that White often championed, they didn't always see eye to eye, but they still respected one another. And Minor White learned a lot about photographic technique from Ansel Adams, which has been mentioned in many catalogs and publications as well. So he learned a lot about technique from Ansel Adams. These are two more photographs from the archive. On the left, you can see Nancy Newhall and one of her colleagues. And to the right, two of Minor White's students. And so I just wanted to, again, highlight Minor White's role as a teacher and how important that was for him. So teaching for him really was a way for him to continue his legacy, but also kind of pass on many of the things that he learned and many of the things that were important to him about the medium. Why did photography matter? Why was it important for him to, publish photographs within the Aperture Magazine? Why was it important for him to pass on this knowledge through teaching? Again, Minor White is such an important figure for his role as an advocate for others. This is a photograph by Emmett Gowan, who is a photographer and is represented in the Princeton University collection. This photograph is called The Hint That Is a Garden. It's dedicated to Frederick Sommer, and I really love this photograph. I'm using it kind of as a little bit of a message about teaching. And it was wonderful to come across this within the Princeton University collection. And this photograph is dedicated to Frederick Sommer, who was a mentor to Emmett Gowan. Emmett, in giving the title, The Hint That Is a Garden, to this photograph, really evokes that idea of a teacher being one who passes down knowledge and also makes students curious about what you might learn. Doesn't exactly give you every single answer or step that you might take, but really kind of pushes you in that direction and makes you excited about what you might learn and points you in that direction. So I think this is a really not only a beautiful photograph on its own, but I think it conveys also a really beautiful message about the role of the teacher and Minor White as being such an important figure for a younger generation of photographers at his time. Okay, this is a quote that I have pulled up from another quote from the Minor White archive. This is again from Minor White's journal, Memorable Fancies. He recorded this on a trip to Arizona, and I'll just read it. He wrote, "All around the cliffs are formed by erosion. Forms change, built-in chance forms appear by chance. Truly the laws of chance must be cosmic." And I love this quote. It's as I mentioned, he recorded it when he was spending a lot of time in nature. And so for Minor White, photography was really a way for him to, to be able to connect to nature and to connect to what was kind of beyond him. And he also felt that photographs, as I mentioned, were not just a personal expression. They were meant to be something that was universal, and they were meant to be, works of art that could connect to the community and that could transmit a message or something to other people. And so this is a concept that's very important to Minor White as a photographer and as an artist working throughout his career. I also wanted to connect this a little bit to some of the photographers that are represented within the exhibition at the Brattleboro Museum. So there is a lot of really wonderful work within this exhibition. So I highly encourage you to go and take a look at the show if you're in the Vermont area, and you can go and take a look at the show in person. If you're not, there's a really wonderful technology that allows you to virtually experience the show. And this is called Easel, which I'm sure Kirsten can speak a little bit more about when we go into the Q&A. But if you go to the Brattleboro Museum of Art site, you'll be able to click on, going through a virtual walkthrough of the exhibition. And that way you can experience the entire show virtually and see these works and click on them and kind of read a little bit more about the artists that are included in the show. So I highly encourage everyone to take a look at that at some point if you're able, or if you can visit the show in person, I highly encourage you to visit the show in person as well. But I just wanted to kind of connect to some of these larger themes within the exhibition. These themes of interiority and these themes of the sequence as being a very important format for minor white. So a number of the photographers that you see highlighted within the exhibition, I think the very first photographer on the very first wall, we see a stacked vertical sequence of his work. And so this kind of shows that the idea of working in multiple is still something that's very popular today. And so I love that Catherine Gasteau has included works by contemporary photographers who are still kind of meditating on the structure of the sequence and choosing to use that structure and format for their own work. Also, I really love that there are photographers included like Nikki Carter, who are working with photography and painting and combining multiple media. This is something that photographers were certainly doing back in the 1950s and 60s, very much thinking about, what does a photograph look like? What does it mean to make photography? And so I really love that there are contemporary photographers represented in sequences who are kind of looking at the limits of photography and thinking about, can I include painting, or how can we, combine processes to make the image, just to make a really fascinating visual image and to make a really beautiful photographic print. Also, photographers that are exploring a sense, I have mentioned this a couple times, of interiority, and exploring this idea, as Catherine has mentioned, of spirit, and this kind of idea of connecting to something larger than yourself, which is really the, when Minor White writes in Arizona about, connecting to the cosmic, he's really thinking here about connecting beyond himself, and photography, again, was a way for him to do that. So really wonderful that there are photographers that are kind of grappling with that idea. Minor White was such an important person within the photographic community in the US in the 1950s and beyond. He was the editor of Aperture, founding editor, as I mentioned, from 1952 to 1976. And he connects with an older generation of photographers, including, Ansel Adams and the photographic historians and curators, Nancy and Beaumont Newhall, to a younger generation, not only his own students, but also these contemporary photographers that are represented in the Brattleboro show. So he's really a figure that sits at the center of photographic history. And so if you're interested in researching more about his work as a teacher and an advocate, or his work as a photographer, I highly encourage you to not only go out and visit the show if you can in person, but to also look at the catalogs, The Eye That Shapes from 1989, in addition to Manifestations of the Spirit, Minor White Manifestations of the Spirit from 2014 at the Getty Center. These are two really great resources which I think anyone who's interested in Minor White would be delighted to see this. And then also a final plug for the Princeton University Art Museum. They have a really wonderful website if you want to go in, and there are resources that you can view to see a chronology of Minor White's life, to look at more works, photographic works within the archive. So that's kind of another resource to plug that there for anyone who's interested in learning and researching a little bit more about Minor White. But that, I think, is all that I have for you. So Kirsten, I don't know if we want to turn it over to questions from the audience.
Sure. Thank you so much, Catherine. That was a great presentation and really exciting to see all of those archival photographs. So thank you for sharing those images with us. I want to remind folks that if you have a question, you can use the Q&A function and add it, ask us that way, or you can ask us in the chat as well. And if you're watching on Facebook, you can ask a question in the comments and we'll keep an eye on that. Catherine, you mentioned the easel tour on our website, which is really excellent. So if you go to brattleboromuseum.org and then click on exhibits and then current exhibits and then sequences, you'll be able to see a great virtual tour of the exhibit and be able to see all the work there. I see we have a couple questions coming in already. This is great. This first person asks, do you think Minor White was influenced more by the history of painting or the history of photography? I'm thinking about his more abstract images.
That I'm just looking at the question in the chat as well. That's a great question. I think certainly by the history of photography. Minor White, I mentioned Nancy and Beaumont Newhall, who were the first, the first curators of photography at the Museum of Modern Art. They had such an important role in the history of photography. Beaumont Newhall put out multiple books they're called The History of Photography. And it's actually the book that I read when I started studying the history of photography. And it's wonderful. So another great resource to look into. Interestingly, the artist I wrote about, Frederick Sommer, he wasn't included in that history of photography book until the very last edition in 1982. So, and a lot of the photographers actually that Minor White worked with and that he published in Aperture Magazine weren't included until that very last journal. So there was a lot of tension in the community about what work should be represented. And I think in the 1950s, when Minor White was, really such a central member of the photographic community, he really just wanted to showcase a lot of emerging photographers that didn't get a lot of attention until much later in their careers, as we can see by these really canonical publications. So to go back to your question, I think, his relationships with figures like Nancy and Beaumont Newhall really tie him to the history of photography. He also really looked back at, and this has been mentioned in various catalogs, the work of Alfred Stieglitz, who was such an important member of, the history of photography, made photographs of clouds that he also made, sequences of works. And so Minor White was very much inspired by that, as others have commented on. So photography was very much where he looked to for mentorship, for inspiration, and kind of where he put his energy into. But I love that you draw in this kind of idea of painting, because it's very important for a number of the artists in the show, right? There are painters included in the show, and then artists that are using paint and photography, which I just love. And it really kind of draws back to a lot of the work that photographers were doing in the 50s and 60s, and it's just wonderful. So I think there definitely is, this influence of painting there as well. I don't know, as much of Minor White's kind of relationship with, painters at that time. I don't know if it was quite as strong, but I think he definitely appreciated, what I will say is he certainly appreciated artists who were willing to be curious and to ask questions and to push beyond, what we really think of is a photograph. Like, can you just paint and photograph, or, can we throw it all together? Can we do something that's a little bit interesting? And he was a person and an artist who is very much open to kind of expanding the boundaries and thinking about, like, why not just like throw it all in there? So great question.
That's great. Thank you. This next question asks, are there any print resources that explicitly illuminate Minor White's teaching practices?
Any print resources?
Yeah.
I read this a very long time ago when I was in school, but there is a really great text on the California School of Fine Arts. So if you Google or go in whatever library database you use, just look at California School of Fine Arts, maybe also Ansel Adams. I can't remember the exact title of the book off the top of my head, but that's a really, really great book. And it talks about Ansel Adams. I believe Minor White is featured as well in that text. And so that'll give you a little bit of, his early career teaching at the California School of Fine Arts and also, the California School of Fine Arts and kind of how important that institution was to teaching photography.
Great, thanks. And I just want to mention that I think we have at least one of those catalogs that you mentioned earlier, the Eye That Shapes. We have a number of resources on Minor White in the exhibit. There's a little study table there, so if anyone's in the Brattleboro area and is able to see the exhibit, you can also check out those resources too. I was thinking about influences as well while you were talking, and I read in one of those books that Minor White was really influenced by poetry in his work. I was wondering if you could speak to that at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Minor White is an artist who drew inspiration from a number of resources. So, he wasn't just looking at, he didn't have blinders on in terms of like, I'm just making photographs, which, makes sense if you think about him being a champion of artists who were combining painting and photography and, doing very kind of experimental avant-garde work within the medium. So he was influenced by poetry. He was influenced by philosophy. He was influenced by Zen teachings, influenced by many, many other sources that really helped to inform the way that he looked at photography. So Minor White, he's a kind of a complicated individual in the sense that he, in mid-century, he was a gay man and he lived closeted for most of his life. And I think he really struggled with his identity. So, things are a little bit different in 2021, but, I think for him, working as an artist was a way for him to work through a lot of these, feelings about his individuality. So poetry, philosophy, connecting with the environment, being able to teach, being able to share knowledge with others was a way for him to, connect with his community and to feel that his voice wasn't really silenced and that he wasn't a figure that, didn't really, didn't have space, within his community. So he definitely looked to poetry. And I will mention his private journal that he wrote, Memorable Fancies. He named it Memorable Fancies after a text by the poet William Blake, the writer William Blake. So he was very influenced, and this is from someone else. I read it somewhere earlier this week, but he was very influenced by poetry, certainly.
That's great. We had a comment. Oh, they're coming in fast. This person says, one might mention also the anthology Aperture Magazine, 1952 to 1976, The Minor White Years, published by Aperture in 2012, a great resource that illuminates Minor White's wide embrace of photography. Yeah. And then this person says, I was a student with Minor first as a graduate student at MIT and also as a student of his teaching the spiritual work of the mystic and teacher G.I. Gurdjieff. I'm so sorry, I probably mispronounced that. Minor was in fact preeminently influenced by the life of insight and the spirit. He was a mystic beyond all else. Wow. So we have a student of Minor White's here on this call. That's great.
That's really wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with the Zoom with everyone here tonight with Brattleboro. That's really wonderful to hear, and yeah, certainly the Aperture anthology, the Minor White Years, specifically if anyone in the audience really wants to read texts from Aperture when it's named after the founding the Minor White Years. So it's all of the articles that were published are a handful of them carefully curated. When he was the founding editor. And so if you want to kind of get a sense of what was being published within Aperture at that time, that's absolutely a really wonderful resource to look at. I used it extensively as a graduate student, and it's really beautifully collated, and there are images as well, and also some images of like the early drafts. So it's really great to see, especially if you haven't done as much, you haven't been able to go to the archive, but you want to learn a little bit more about Minor White and about how Aperture came into being. That's another really wonderful resource. So I absolutely recommend it to anybody who's interested in learning more about Minor White. And I would also like to mention that I said that Aperture is still up and running today. They also have a really great digital archive as well. There might be like a subscription or something, but they have published a lot of materials as well that you can look at from 1952 up until today. Really, really great resource. And they also just, if you type in aperture.org, you can go to their platform, and they're still publishing articles. And I think that's an important thing to highlight, because at the time that Minor White was working and was the founding editor, Aperture, it almost collapsed. There were people who were saying, "Oh, Minor White, what are you publishing? All of these, all of these kind of weird young photographers." And he was like, "Well, I'm the editor, so I get to choose," which is wonderful. But also, he really, really fought to keep Aperture alive, and he really, really fought for these younger photographers. And so I think it's so incredible that now today we can just type in aperture.org, or you can kind of read a print version from your library. And so it's great that it still exists today, and it's very much thriving. And last thing I will say is it still represents the work of young emerging photographers. So if you're interested in kind of seeing not only photographers that are included in the Brattleboro Museum, but photographers who might be up and coming, there are a number of established photographers presented in the magazine too, but I really love looking at it just to read like who's a new photographer that I maybe haven't heard of. And so Aperture is really great for that.
That's great. Thanks so much. We have another question. This person asks, in doing all this in-depth research, is there one Minor White photograph that you consider a personal favorite or that stands out to you?
That's a really great question. That's a good question. I will say, there's one really beautiful photograph that's included in the Brattleboro show. I think it's the very last one. And I forget the name of it precisely, but it's the last one on the wall before I think you hit kind of the end of the show. And Minor White made a number of photographs, kind of a sequence of photographs in Rochester when he was teaching there and working as an editor at Aperture, and very involved with the George Eastman House, now George Eastman Museum. But he made these photographs of ice and icicles on his window. And I think, trying to remember who wrote about this, but there's, a curator who writes about how the move to New York it wasn't very easy for Minor White. I think anyone who's experienced a huge cross-country trip kind of understands that feeling of being uprooted. And I think when Minor White first got to Rochester, he wasn't as comfortable there, and it was a little bit of again, I didn't know him personally, so anyone who knew him well maybe might know him, that transition a little bit better. But I really love these photographs of icicles and of like snowflakes, and melting ice and snow. And, if you've ever been to Rochester, you know how bitterly cold it is, and the lake effect and the snow and how intense that is. And I love that Minor White kind of captured those moments, and they're very like abstract photographs, but he finds a way to make these abstract works. I think Kirsten is, yeah. Oh yeah, 72 North Union Street, Rochester, 1962. So I think this was close to his residence. So, I mean, this is just it's pretty beautiful. And he finds a way, Catherine mentioned this in her talk, which if any of you are interested in looking not just at a virtual tour of the show, but if you want to see, experience and listen to Catherine Gastow's, her introduction to the exhibition, she did a really wonderful walkthrough, which is available on the Brattleboro Museum site. And she talks actually in her presentation about some of these works that Minor White made in Rochester, but also about the works in the show is kind of exploring being both micro and macroscopic at once, where you kind of see this, it's like you're looking at something in a microscope, but you're also kind of seeing like a constellation. And so I think that those works are pretty magical and so beautiful. And they really stand as a testament to Minor White, perhaps working through a more difficult period in his career and in his personal life possibly, but really finding something beautiful in those cold winters in Western New York.
Yeah, they are really stunning photographs in person as well as in the virtual world.
Okay.
This person asks, I'm inspired by the work of Minor White. Today, photography as art is influenced by postmodernism, which rejects modernism and the work of Minor White and other important photographers. Do you think that there will be a reemergence of modernist sensibilities in contemporary art photography in the near future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think Minor White can definitely be included, within that, that group of modernist photographers. But as I mentioned, he really, really pushed to provide visibility to emerging photographers, even if he didn't really agree with maybe their theories about photography. He was always kind of pushing their work to the forefront. And I think a number of photographers who maybe have been understudied or haven't really been given their due, a sense of really good recognition. Frederick Sommer, who I wrote my dissertation on, is one of those photographers who really wouldn't have received as much visibility as he did without the advocacy of Minor White within Aperture. And so I think a lot of these photographers who Minor White really helped to bring visibility to and give a voice for within his time, we're seeing a lot of those photographers gain some visibility now. So that's really wonderful. And even Minor White as an individual was for a long time really not studied as much. And I think that, if you really work within this field, you can't go far without like bumping into Minor White. Like if you're doing any research, on 20th century American photography, at some point, you're probably going to have to grapple with Minor White's legacy and his influence. And so I think it's also important to kind of highlight that Minor White himself is really an individual who deserves further study and attention. So I think it's really wonderful that the Brattleboro Museum has chosen to not only to exhibit the work of Minor White, which you see, I think in that as I worked through easel, it's like at the end of the exhibit, which I think was an intentional choice that the curator made to kind of highlight the work of a lot of contemporary artists, which is a choice that I think Minor White would have loved. So I'm all for it. But I think that, that kind of question of Minor White's enduring legacy is still kind of rising to the surface. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done on his own career. And so I would love to see more work kind of come out. And I think that more work will continue to emerge as people continue to research his life and work. But that's a very good question. And I think, hopefully we'll see, some attention back to Minor White.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's it for our questions, unless anybody has any last minute questions you want to sneak in at the end. But this has been really wonderful. I've really enjoyed having this show, Sequences Ode to Minor White, at the Brattleboro Museum. And as the education manager, I've been giving tours and talking a little bit about Minor White. And it's just so great to learn more about him and his legacy, especially about his teaching, and that so much of his legacy is tied up in the generations of photographers that have come after him. So that was just really wonderful to hear. Katie Gasto is with us, the curator, and she says, thank you for a wonderful talk. So thanks, Katie. Glad you were listening. So I think with that, well, I think we'll wrap it up there. So before we sign off, I just wanted to let everyone know that there's a recording of tonight's event, and it will be available on our website in the next day or two. And that's at brattleboromuseum.org. And while you're there, you can find a lot of other recordings of other events that we've done over the past year. And you'll find those under the events and then video archive. And if you happen to be in Brattleboro, please come to the museum and check out the show. We're open Wednesday to Sunday, 10 to 4, and admission is pay as you wish. And finally, if you'd like to make a donation, if you enjoyed tonight's program, we would really appreciate your support, and you can do that at brattleboromuseum.org/support. So I think that does it. Catherine, thank you so much again, and thanks everyone for joining us. This was really great. We had one more comment. Someone said thank you, and this is a wonderful forum, greatly appreciated. So thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us. Stay safe and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.